Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Ari Thuriger and today I'm here to talk about the historical heathen celebration of Alfablot, a sacrifice to the elves, the heathen Halloween. Well, not really, but we shall see. Although it is curious to notice that many people assume to be a kind of Old Norse version of Halloween, which is understandable, given the amount of blogs and other posts all over social media networks connecting Alfablot with Halloween, mostly thanks to some Ausauthor groups and associations that have chosen to follow the week and wheel of the year, placing tightly each celebration on the calendar with very specific dates throughout the year, fixed dates, and usually Alfablot being nowadays a fixed celebration at the end of October, the 31st of October, to give modern heathens, well, modern also through, the possibility to celebrate something on their own during Halloween. Well then, first things first. If you remember my video on the heathen holidays, I have spoken about the three most important celebrations of Old Norse society and when they were held. Rather than following fixed dates on the calendar, pre-Christian Old Norse society followed the cycles of the moon. Yule is one of the most important celebrations in the old calendar. It has been replaced by the celebration of Christmas, including ceasing to be celebrated by following the lunar calendar and instead became a fixed date. The actual pre-Christian Yule feast occurred at the first full moon after the first new moon following the winter solstice. Now, it's important to remember that King Haakon the Good, or King Haakon I of Norway, in the mid-10th century, moved the heathen Yule to be at the same time as Christmas, which was by that time understood to be in the solstice. Mind you that Christmas was on the solstice until the Julian calendar was rectified by the Gregorian calendar 6 centuries after Haakon's time, so in the 16th century. So when Haakon I of Norway moved Yule to the same date as Christmas, he was moving it to the solstice, the same date Christians celebrated Christmas at that time. And this is very important because from that moment on, the Scandinavian calendars start to have Yule on the solstice, and also, and especially, Icelandic calendars thereafter. This changed the dates of the celebrations. The Icelandic calendar, after Christianization, after the 10th century, shows clear differences from the celebrations held in continental Scandinavia in pre-Christian times. For instance, as I said, there were three main holidays in pre-Christian heathen times. Yule being one of them, which Haakon I again moved to the solstice, and so in Icelandic calendars from the 10th century onwards, we have Yule at the winter solstice. And we see the celebration of Alfablot as well on the full moon of November, more or less around that time, a celebration to the Alfar, a sacrifice to the Elves, an Icelandic celebration. And we have, for instance, also the Icelandic celebration called Disting at the full moon of March, which has a parallel here with Dissablot back in the continent, but instead of being celebrated around September or October, as it was in the continent, in Scandinavia, it was passed on to March in Iceland. Probably because of the climate and geographical differences between Iceland and mainland Scandinavia, especially southern Scandinavia, and as such, in Iceland, the agrarian cycle must have been quite different, and it is different as winter is even longer and summers are less warm than in mainland Europe. Now, it is important to know when and where we have the first mention of the celebration of Alfablot. It comes from an account in the early 11th century by the Norwegian and Christian skald Sigvatr Thordarson, traveling to Sweden, and he reported that at the time, during a period we would call autumn, Sigvatr was refused entry at every farm and temple, because the celebration of Alfablot was being held, the sacrifice to the elves, right? This account can be read in chapter 92 of the saga of Olaf the Holy in Snorre Sturluson's Heimskringla. Sigvatr was even refused entry at the temple in a farm, a religious building probably held by the owner and family at the farmstead. They told him it was a sacred time, and he, as a stranger to the family, could not enter. For a couple of days, he continues on to try his luck among the Swedes, but no one would have him, and many chased him away, for it was the time of the celebration of Alfablot. Once this celebration started, amongst family members, right, outsiders to the family and to the private environment could not enter, for the place was hallowed. This account gives us indication that the harvest celebration was an important rite for those who still held on to the heathen celebrations and customs. Alfablot was a very private and sacred celebration where outsiders from other settlements could not be expected to have hospitality, making this celebration something more private and to be celebrated within the familiar groups rather than a public celebration. Little else is known about this celebration from this account, sadly, other than it took place after the harvests, somewhere around the end of October and the beginning of November, probably. And probably still following the lunar calendar, so having no fixed date. Now, we have the later account of the Ynglinga saga. If I'm not mistaken, it's the chapter 8, dating to the first half of the 13th century, this account, which lists the 3 great blots of the year, the 3 great celebrations or sacrifices. On winter day, first day of winter, there should be a blot, a sacrifice for a good year, and in the middle of winter for a good crop, and the 3rd blot should be on summer day, a victory blot. The latter in Old Norse is the celebration of Sigurblot, which means victory blot, victory sacrifice. This source gives us a better understanding of the main celebrations in Old Norse society. 3 major Old Norse blots, sacrifices, a year, and these were publicly held at Uppsala, Sweden. The references we have concerning the Alfablot clearly points to a celebration done by families in their own homesteads, private and in domestic environments, right? And within temples controlled by the lords and landowners. Alfablot would have probably been held on the full moon of October or November. Hard to determine. The main holidays were winter nights held on the first day of winter, Jul, in the middle of winter, and Sigurblot on summer day. Winter nights was celebrated on the full moon closest to the autumnal equinox. In pre-Christian Scandinavia, winter didn't begin in the winter solstice at the 21st of December, but it began at the last full moon of the autumnal equinox, or the autumn equinox. Yule, a 3-day holidays, as was said here before on other videos, was celebrated at midwinter, which is the time of the 3 full moons after the full moon when winter began. And 3 full moons before the full moon that marked the beginning of summer. Meaning that Yule was 3 full moons, 3 moon cycles after the harvest moon being somewhere around September or October. Alfablot, therefore, would have been a full moon celebration right after the harvests. Because it wasn't publicly displayed or held, and much of it remains secrecy due to its very private character, there's little we know about it. And I'm saying this because I've read all sorts of stuff concerning Alfablot and what it was all about, but it's just mostly speculation. Still, when we don't have information about it, we make do. At the end of the day, our own spiritualities, religions, belief systems, and the way we choose to express ourselves towards all of that, I think the most important thing is that we do what is meaningful to us. We do what is significant to us and makes sense in that moment towards that thing. However, historically speaking, what we do know about Alfablot is what I've just told you these past few minutes. As previously said, Snorri's Heimskringla is sadly the only written source we have where we learn that there was a celebration called Alfablot in some parts of Sweden. The account strongly suggests that the celebration was held after the harvest time, which places it quite safely round about the same time that Middle-aged Christians of the Middle Age would later celebrate All Saints' Eve, what has become Halloween in modern English. However, and again, it's highly unlikely that Alfablot was on a fixed day and instead followed the lunar calendar, not only because it was a heathen holiday, most likely, as the account suggests, a celebration of several days, and being a heathen celebration, or a pagan celebration, if you will, would then follow the lunar calendar still. But it is also curious to notice that it is quite possible that Sigvatr was refused entry while this celebration was held, not because he was a stranger, not just that, but because he was a Christian. We shall get there. We could argue that Alfablot may have at some point been held on the same date as All Saints' Eve because, just as Yule was moved to follow the Christian calendar and celebrations, it's possible that at some point the same may have happened or occurred to the celebration of Alfablot. However, given the fact that Sigvatr was a Christian and was refused entry, it's probably because Alfablot was still a celebration for heathens, for pagans, and not for Christians. Hospitality not having been given to a Christian by the heathens may have been a form of protecting the celebration itself. Part of the account actually tells us that in one of the places Sigvatr was refused entry was on a farm in which the husfrøya, the lady of the household, literally the housefrøya, told him to go away. She says they, herself, and the heathens inside fear Odin's wrath. We are pagans, she says. And this implies that the woman and possibly her family and whoever else was inside were afraid to offend Odin and cause his wrath by inviting a Christian, also implying that they fear Odin far more than they fear the Christian God. The presence of a Christian would bring about the wrath of Odin in what was to be an holy heathen celebration. We are talking about a celebration in the rural areas of Sweden of the 11th century, a celebration linked to the old agrarian cycles, and people holding on to their old traditions. The fear of Christianity was the fear of change and the fear of the destruction and forgetfulness of the old ways. This may actually be the reason that led to Sigvatr not finding hospitality during this period of celebration. Perhaps not so much because it was a private celebration, but also, which it was, obviously, it was not publicly displayed, surely, but more because he was of a different faith, and I shall develop that a little bit further ahead. Or Snorri Sturluson made an exaggeration out of this account, as he always did, for he himself was a Christian, and this account passes on the idea that heathens actually break the sacred law of hospitality. Who knows? But anyway, as far as we can tell from this account, Alfablot was a harvest rite, and it may be quite possible a time when ordinary rules of hospitality were put aside. It was not an ordinary time. The fact that this celebration wasn't publicly held already makes it quite unique, and was probably a celebration only held in the countryside, and not part of the main celebrations held during the year in the centers of power and in the trading centers. Hence this reluctance, this privacy, this fear of customs and traditions that were not so customary in the rural areas yet. And being a celebration towards the elves, we are talking about not only land spirits, but also some of the ancestors that would become elves, would become spirits, wights of the land. So it would have been a celebration towards the fertility of the soils, to give thanks to the spirits of the earth responsible for the blessings of the crops and the plentiful harvest, making this celebration quite unique in its own way. And again, taking into account that Sigvatr was chased away because the place of celebration had become hallowed ground after the ritual had begun, this could mean many things. Not only what I have stated before concerning the denial of a person from another faith, but it could also mean that, indeed, this celebration was strictly held by the family or by the people who lived at the settlement. This idea of privacy within hallowed ground makes sense given the fact that it was a celebration towards the Alfar, the Elves. As previously stated on other videos, deceased relatives could become elves. This is linked to the tradition of the burial mounds, on which several rites were performed in order to keep a certain connection with the dead relatives. And some dead relatives would become elves, the beneficial ancestors, spirits of the land, and would continue to provide something beneficial within the vicinity of their burial mounds, on the private lands owned by the family and the descendants of the person buried there. There seems to be a certain feeling of sacredness towards the privacy that this celebration was built upon, because people may have been dealing with a celebration towards their own dead relatives, their own ancestors who have become elves, the beneficial dead. In other words, the dead relatives have become auxiliary spirits that promote the fertility of the soils and therefore fruitful and successful harvests. The entrance of a stranger to the family may anger the spirits of the deceased, the spirits of the land that has become hallowed after the ritual. Therefore, it is sacred ground. No one can step into except the descendants, the family members, or of the dead that are being honored in those hallowed grounds, obviously. I think we ought to briefly express a somewhat general idea concerning the elves in Old Norse accounts, not wanting to repeat what has been said here on this channel in other videos concerning such entities. I will leave at the end of this video two suggested videos I have done in the past concerning the elves. One about the idea of rebirth or reincarnation in Old Norse sources, and the other one concerning the cult of the dead. So that is covered, and obviously if you have the time, please watch those two videos, which may better give an idea concerning the importance of the elves, both as land spirits but also as the spirits of the ancestors. Taking that into consideration, it is understandable why Alfablot was such a private celebration. We may be in the presence of a type of taboo within Old Norse society, a socially accepted restriction within a time of celebration to avoid angering the ancestors or even offend them. Remember that the lady of the house says that they, the heathens performing the rites, fear the wrath of Odin. Odin is also, among other things, the god of death and of the dead. Angering or offending the dead, by extension, one angers the entity that presides over them. Now, taking a look at some Icelandic sagas, and my apologies, but I can't quite precise which ones right now, but at the end of this video I'll leave the bibliography, don't worry. But anyway, some Icelandic sagas do speak of the elves. In one of the accounts there's a woman called Thordis, and she's an oracle, a seeress. This woman has the ability to protect people, and she's sought after for help. There's a particular man who has been injured and the wound doesn't heal. So he seeks the help of this oracle woman. She advises this man to go into a hill, sacrifice a bull in there, and smear the soil around the hill with the blood of the animal, and to make a feast out of the bull's flesh to the elves that in there dwell. And after the sacrificial ritual is done, the man will be healed. So we see the healing characteristics associated with the elves, with the spirits of the land. In this case, they dwell in a hill, which the source isn't concrete about the nature of this hill, but there's plenty of accounts where the elves dwell in the burial mounds. Such burial mounds often associated with the god Freyr, god of fertility, plenty, peace, sexual relations, and death, among other things, including rebirth. One important detail of this account, which I have purposely not mentioned, but I will now, is that in order for the entire ritual to be successful, the man performing the ritual to heal his wounds needed the ring of a person named Steinherd. It is implied that it is a piece of jewelry that belonged to a dead man, possibly the very person buried in the mound where the ritual to the elves is to take place. If you remember the video I've done on reincarnation or rebirth in Old Norse beliefs, you know what this is all about. In that video, as well as in the video about the cult of the dead and the cult of the burial mound, as well as the worship, veneration of the burial dwellers, a video which I've also previously mentioned, there's a wonderful account concerning the dead man Olaf Geirstadahalfr, which people continue to worship him after his death. A cult performed in his burial mound. When Olaf died, he appeared in a dream of a man named Hrani. Olaf, in the dream, gave this man instructions to break into his burial mound, take Olaf's gold ring, knife, and belt, and he must fight the dweller of the burial mound, a Draugr, Olaf himself in physical form. After Hrani successfully takes Olaf's ring, knife, and belt, Olaf instructed him that he must go to Queen Åsta, the wife of Harald the Greenlander. She is waiting to give birth to a child. Long story short, sorry, I'm not going to repeat what I've said in that video for your own sake. However, Hrani gives Olaf's belt to the queen, and he himself is to name the child Olaf as well. And when the boy is born, he gives him Olaf's ring as well as the knife, or on another account, it's a sword. The idea here is to pass on the dead man's properties, the important objects that contain the spiritual essence of the dead man. The belt, which is his might and strength, the knife or sword, his protective weapon that also bears his essence as a warrior and as a nobleman, and his ring, the spirit essence and his status. And by giving the same name to the child, the dead man lives on in this child. This is a form of rebirth or reincarnation we see in these old Nordic societies. In the account of the oracle or the seeress, the man that is to perform the ritual needs a dead man or the dead man's ring, a token of the dead man's identity, power, status, and spiritual essence, in order to create a bond with the mound dweller, which in this case, after death, probably became a land wight, a land spirit, an elf, giving us the perception that such a condition was taken upon death by the spirit of the dead man because he was probably good in life or connected to some aspects that were deemed to be beneficial, because elves in Old Norse and Icelandic sources are connected to beneficial things mostly and connected to the earth, to the soils. So upon death, the beneficial dead continue on giving to the community of human persons. This has parallels with another account, several actually. I remember the one about the very god Freyr, which at Old Uppsala, the god dwells in a burial mound precisely, and he is the lord of the elves, so people keep sacrificing treasures to his mound in order to receive several years of peace and plenty and fertility. But that's not the one I wanted to talk about. The account of King Halfdan, and people kept sacrificing to him after his death, much like as they did to the god Freyr. King Halfdan, whose reign was one of peace and plenty, a very prosperous time during his life and reign. Upon his death, many were those who wanted to bury him in the districts belonging to his domains to ensure good fortune. So they dismembered him and divided his body, his corpse, and buried him in different districts. And so everyone was happy to have his blessings all over the place. The beneficial dead, the beneficial ancestors, keep on being worshipped and sacrifices held at their burial mounds. These become elves, the protective, life-giving and fertility-making spirits of the land. So here's a strong reason why the sacrifice of Alfablot was restricted to strangers, not only strangers of a different faith, but strangers to the family to whom the ancestors being venerated belong to. As soon as the space of sacrifice is hallowed after the rite, the dead of the land, the beneficial ones that have become elves, are wakened and called upon. And everything and everyone that might anger them or turn them away becomes taboo. People were dealing with the ancestors bound to the old ways. And angering the ancestors could bring about terrible consequences to the living, because the spirits of the ancestors, these elves, might turn away, and thus the beneficial aspects are no longer given to the community of the living, thus denying survival of the descendants. And could just as well be a celebration to remember the dead, remember the ancestors, and such ancestors could get angry and disappear due to being forgotten, shown by the presence of elements of a new faith. We keep seeing these behavioral patterns in animistic societies. At specific moments of sacredness and of ritual, certain aspects of life are taboo. And not only that, but also it must be respected the temporary restrictions, and strangers are not allowed in those periods to avoid a break in the cycle of life and in the cycles that ensure survival. Something spoken here quite recently on the video about animism and the act of giving permission. So, I think it is safe to say that we are facing a celebration, a sacrifice and a ritual performance to the elves, be those land spirits of the mound or the hills, or the beneficial ancestors. Perhaps indeed the primary aim of this celebration was to ensure fertility, health, protection, abundance, a question of survival of the community of the living human persons, because it is, after all, a celebration after the harvests. In a way, rethinking this through, it isn't so different and also very close in time to the Christian All Saints' Eve celebration, which corresponds in time and also more or less in its primary function with the Gaelic Samhain and the more recent Halloween and the Day of the Dead. The dead are involved. Perhaps the intentions vary, of course, according to the religions, belief systems, and the needs of communities at a particular time, but the theme of death and the dead is present. So, there you have. Happy Alfablot. And I hope this video was useful and entertaining. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.